birthday watershed coalition we had formed in order to clean up after the 2013 flood. So we had to clear fallen trees, debris. We had to put boulders in all of our streams to create meanders, so we prevent future floods, hopefully. Every summer, we still plant willow stakes along the riparian areas and full invasives. We also, in the last few years, have gotten really committed to forest health, having experienced wildfires in our area. And so what we do, we work with different organizations to focus on the forests. If they're dead or diseased, we get them cut down, we build we have pile burns, etc. So that brings us up to today. What we're doing currently is writing grants again. The initial grants were about $4.5 million for 14 projects to restore the valley. Now we get grants from local, state, and federal agencies to do further work in fire prevention. What that means, when we get those grants, they ask for matching funds, and that's where you all come in. Because your funds help us, your donations help us win grants, and they also help us keep the valley safe. So, now I have to tell you one last thing. This week is Colorado Gives Week. If you type in Colorado Gives on your computer, you go there, find our organization, Estes Valley Watershed Coalition, type in amount of money, and Colorado Gives will match it. This is the only time all year when we get matching funds from our wonderful donors. So think about it. We just love seeing you at these presentations, whether you donate or not, but we ask you to keep it in mind. And now we have Jared, you say your last name.
Gricoskie.
And he is the founder and owner of Yellow Wood Guiding. I'll tell you, if you go to his website, the reviews are sensational. He's really good at what he does. He's spoken for our group twice already. This is going to be good. So thanks for coming.
It's a lot of pressure, Celeste. It's one of those things I always love about doing presentations is there's faces I recognize. And so 2 or 3 years ago, hi, thanks for seeing y'all again. And so if you don't know me, I run a company called Yellowwood Guiding. I've been here in the Estes Valley since 2005. And so my one always interesting question is, from an audience standpoint, how many people have also been here since at least 2005? It gives me perspective, because I can reach out to people and be like, what have you seen? And so that's the part that's always fascinating. I knew what I wanted to do, and I claimed the Estes Valley as my home. And so the crazy thing is, I've been here for more than 20 years. And that's hard to say when I'm 43, but 20 years is a long time, and it's amazing how much I've seen change. And so that's the whole idea of this presentation, because I've been going through kind of a midlife crisis, talking about how things used to be and how they're changing and looking for positivity. I just got a plug-in hybrid to finally put my money where my mouth is as I talk about climate change all the time. And so there's some factors that are amazing, but at the same time, 20 years is a long time to see and get moments with clients and out in the national park and here in Estes Valley. And so on that idea, if you want to go to the website, ywguiding.com, normally what I do is 4-hour tours with 1 to 4 people. And so I get this brief amount of time with people, usually folks that have haven't been here before, and it's always amazing how much they don't know and how much they want to see, but at the same time, I try to make it simple. I do wildlife tours, that's what I do a lot, photo tours, photography tours, and then hiking tours. And so there's summer, there's winter, those vary a lot. But in those moments of being out in the park, there's beautiful opportunities, and that's what I'm always struck by. There are moments that you have to stop and look and say, holy cow. What's amazing is this was 2022. The last time the alpine sunflowers were that good was 2016. And I have that picture on my website, and people want to take that picture. And I have to say, I don't know. It's going to be what's it going to be when the season comes. But the reason I showed this picture on a wildlife presentation is that's really easy to see a pattern. There are other moments and places where you see animals sometimes, and then there's the once-in-a-lifetime moments and the once-in-a-decade moments. And so I start with this shot to know that sometimes it's very obvious, but it's also really hard to know when you're at the last day you'll ever see that. And that's the shocking moment, but there's also the day that you'll never know. And so there's things in the season that you know are gonna happen. The bluebirds are going to show up in Moraine Park sometime in March and April. And you can go out and find them, and sadly their population's gone down. It's gone up a little bit in the last year. But then there's also moments that every year you can go into Moraine Park and find the biggest elk. And so if anybody's onto that Facebook side of things, this is Atlas. Last year. He's a little bigger this year. I haven't seen Atlas in weeks. But he went from all the way up the Bear Lake corridor, down to Moraine Park, down to the YMCA, and eventually to the golf course. And so it's one of those things that, I always find it fascinating. If you look online, everyone says, go to the golf course. And that's right, about 2 times a year. But there's places where that's gonna happen. The same idea that there's going to be moments that you're gonna see that the elk calves every year, starting around the end of May. And so one of those amazing ideas is the elk rut starts at the same time, the calving season starts at the same time. That's controlled by photo period. You can count on it no matter what. The temperature is not going to change the year, the time of year, it's going to change the location. But every year, 80% of babies are born between May 25th and June 15th. It's one of these amazing periods. And so this is where it becomes deep. I have a spreadsheet. I started from 2005, when I first moved here, and I started documenting everything I saw. Every tour I do, I talk and write it down of what I saw, where I saw it. And so these dates are partly from books, partly from PhD papers, and a lot of it is looking at my own data. And so there's these patterns that you can see. Moose babies are born about a week later. Their gestation period is about a week shorter, which is fascinating. But they're born, the females are conceiving, I should say, a week later too, usually more in the beginning of October. But this is what I love about being a guide. Knowing exactly where to go and increasing your chances. And so what I love about this moment is I remember everything about this picture. Because I was here with my brother and his wife, and she wanted to see moose. And so we went out the day before and saw 26. That's my record, 26 in a day. We saw 0 babies. And so the next day, we wake up at 4 in the morning, head out, and lo and behold, this calf was born 12 hours before. And what I can never forget is as we watched for hours, 18 other moose came up to try to sniff that calf, and I've never seen violence in this national park next to that mother chasing away those other 18 moose as they all wanted to get a sniff. And what's striking is I don't see moose in that spot anymore. But there's other moments too where you can go out and find things if you just put enough effort. I've been out with Andy and Rachel looking for snowshoe hares, and man is it hard. And there's other times where you turn around and they're right behind you, but effort sometimes plays a role. And then there's dumb luck. So like this shot is a shot I had with a client, and we'll never forget, is as we're waiting in Moraine Park, He scratches his nose right before the coyote jumped, and he missed it. And we waited another 20 minutes, and he jumped. And he got it. And then there's this moment. I had 3 kids from CSU, and they were all wildlife biology majors. And I'm always sad for those folks, it's so hard to get a job, but they're so passionate. And they wanted to see a long-tailed weasel. And I'm like, guys, that's a long shot at best. And we drive into the Moraine Park campground, and here's this weasel running around for 10 minutes. And it's one of these moments that will stay. But then there's things that are harder. Driving around in the wintertime, business is a lot slower, a lot less. If you notice, town is rather quiet this week. It's kind of lovely, but weather's too nice. Everybody's missing out. But many years ago, driving around this time of year, a bobcat sighting is amazing. If you look close, he has a cataract. But one of those things I always said is, I don't know when I'm going to see a mountain lion, but the 3rd time it happened, I finally got a photograph. I've seen 3 in all these 20 plus years. And so you never know when that's going to happen. But I thought, maybe. But I never thought I'd see bears mating. And so there's these moments that are just special. But in those moments that are special, there's places that you put in the back of your head, and I think, well, I could take my clients to see this. And so this is on Endo Valley Road. There's this one patch, and it's about as big as a bighorn sheep. And if they stand exactly there, it's one of the most amazing pieces of lichen. And I've seen that happen twice. That's the first time, in May 2011. And it happened one other time in 2013. And I drive by that spot every year for 2 decades, hoping to see it again. And it's never happened again. I don't even see sheep in that spot very likely anymore. And so, in 4 hours, my job is to get people out and see as much as you can. And so I make a near guarantee that we're going to see some 99% chance if we go out. And so these numbers are here so that you can pause the video, you can take a picture and look at it later. But one of the things that I always find fascinating is there's certain reliabilities, but you got to know where to go, when to go, and where that gets fascinating is the moose. Everybody wants to see a moose, but at the right time of year, in the summer, I can show you a moose most of the time. The catch is the distance is getting farther and farther away, but if you show up in May, if you show up in June, if you're here in April and you're lucky and the weather's fantastic, there's a pretty good chance we can see a moose. And then every single person that has booked a winter wildlife tour with me lately wants to see a moose, and I tell them, y'all, it's tough. And every once in a while, if you look at the November through January, there's a 4% chance. And so I always tell folks, that's kind of tough. And then everybody wants to see a bear. And I'm amazed that it's asking for the wrong thing. When I get these folks from Iowa, Nebraska, and they want to see an elk, it's the easiest tour. But when folks want to see a bear, and they show up at almost any time outside of berry season, it's a crapshoot at best. And then I always get foreigners that really want to see a mountain lion, and my response is go to Patagonia. But if you're here, I've seen 3 in nearly 5,000 tours. And so your chances are there, but man, is it not good. And so I always love those ideas, but there's chances, but these numbers have changed over time. And that's what struck me, and that's what gave me the idea for this presentation, is the bighorn number was a lot higher in the past at different seasons. The coyote number was a lot higher in the past. The elk is getting harder. They're starting to move around. And so on that idea, this is just beyond the rock cut on Trail Ridge Road. And Enos Mill talks about seeing bighorn sheep up there in his writings. And so what I always find fascinating is you can just read the older books, and sometimes they follow suit. And amazingly, these animals were there in sometimes June, especially July, and then there was this moment in August. And they would be there almost every week, and then it stopped. they're not there anymore. And so if you're familiar, you go around the corner past the old snow play area. Anybody that ever got to play in the snow play area? Right, I mean, can't park there anymore, but this is right around the corner from the snow play area. And there was this fantastic moment where these bighorn rams would go exactly there and then spend time up by the rock cut, and sometimes walk all the way up to the Forest Canyon overlook, and then it stopped happening. And so between my first arrival full-time here, 2005, about 2018, every one of these yellow spots were places to look. Now, those far sides out of Mount Ida, you need a spotting scope. And so grab the spotting scope, we go out looking. Nothing's more amazing to people than seeing tiny dots way out there zoomed in, and you realize the sheep are all the way out there. But it wasn't these rams. These particular rams stayed on Trail Ridge most of the summer. And then my opportunity went away. In the last few years, I haven't seen them at all in that exact spot. And so the other part of this that's amazing is I also stopped seeing them on Mount Ida. And so the question always as a naturalist then is, why? What happened? So we know that bighorn sheep are vulnerable to pneumonia, lungworm, and then maybe the elk competition is an issue, but there's some other issues. That exact spot became this super famous place on Instagram for wedding photography. And I never saw sheep after I saw wedding dresses there. And then Mount Ida became this very popular hike. And same story, the sheep have declined. Now they're not gone on Mount Ida. You can see them in June until about the 5th or 8th of July. And then that's exactly when the snow melts on the trailhead at Cooter Lakes. And like magic, the rams that are there are gone. And they're beyond the area that I can go. And so remember, when I'm talking about these places, this is where I can take people in 4 hours. And most of my clients are nowhere capable of walkers or hikers. They're out of breath most of the time just getting out of the car. You know, I've been on top of Mount Ida, and hopefully some of y'all been on top of Mount Ida. It's amazing. But man, that's not a 4-hour hike. And so on these moments, it was beautiful. I tell people, get ready, look around the corner, right below the road. And it faded to the point where this is the last sight egg I had. It went from being 8 or 10 to 3, and then this ram was the last one. And I haven't seen any rams in that spot since. And so there were 2 ewes. They were all the way across the Mount Ida the week before. They came over Rock Cut this year. But I've seen no rams there. And it was the most amazing opportunity to stand right there at the Rock Cut, and they'd be right below you licking the minerals off of that mineral lake. And it's changed. That same idea is ptarmigan have faded in populations. And so when I first got here reading about where to go find birds, where to go find animals, talking to the rangers, they're like, oh yeah, go on the trail by the rock cut, go by the Alpine Visitor Center. And that happens if you're lucky. I have one client where we went out looking for moose over on the west side of the park, and twice in 5 years apart, we went all the way, found our moose, came back, and Ptarmigan, Mr. Ptarmigan, sitting right there on the corner of Medicine Bow Park. It doesn't always happen, but those are special moments. Now, if you get out hiking, it's much more possible. But here's where it gets interesting. Hopefully you're familiar with that view up at Gore Range Overlook. And so, way out there on the Never Summer Range, with a lot of magnification and a calm day, which is rare, you can see sheep, but more intriguingly, on Specimen Mountain, there's sheep there a lot in the spring. So these dots here are the places I would look and the places I would see them. And so where this gets amazing to me is after the fire, if the fire was nowhere near the northern side of the Never Summer Range, the sheep disappeared. The sheep on the Specimen Mountain area are still there. And that tells me that people are playing a role to some degree. There's not a lot of people going up to the summits on the Never Summer Range, but you can't hike up to the crater anymore. So those sheep are still there. Now, I always like to joke that many of the places in the national park, their names are wrong, and it's a part of time. and that's the problem. Like Sheep Lakes is a great place to see sheep between April and June. The whole rest of the year, it's just dumb luck. But also, you zoom out and Bighorn Mountains up there. Sometimes it's a great place to see sheep in that area, but Sheep Lakes, if you're patient and persistent, you can possibly see bighorn sheep because they go and they lick the minerals there at that glacial lake. But in the past, I used to be able to go all along those hotels on Highway 34 and have amazing bighorn sheep opportunities. And it started to decline. And I kept documenting and saying, oh, okay, so these spots, each red dot is how often I saw sheep in that spot in that roughly 10-year time frame. And then that's the part that's always amazing. You never know when you're at the last year, when it changes and it's over. Because about 2015, my spots that were so good stopped. I have no idea what happened to those exact sheep. Probably lungworm, maybe impact from elk, but they're gone. They're not there in those spots. There are still sheep at Sheep Lakes, and if you look up onto the hill, at one of those magical places, everybody stops at Sheep Lakes and forlornly hopes to see some sheep. But you need some optics, because if you look on the alluvial fan, every day that's nice, between April and May 25th, there will be sheep somewhere on the hillside around the alluvial fan, and sometimes all the way up to the start of Old Fall River Road. But those areas by the hotels, they're not there anymore. Which is amazing to understand that when the sheep were taken from the national park area to populate the Big Thompson Canyon, it was from that spot. And so they survived reintroductions and population changes, and they faded. And so what's amazing and heartbreaking to me is every one of these amazing moments were in that exact area. And it doesn't happen anymore. And so the biggest thing I'd say is that those moments that you have, hold on to them. You never know when it might be the last. But also, you get used to it. You're like, oh, this will never change. And that's where it impacted. And so one day, the sheep were gone. And everybody wants to see bighorn sheep. And so I had to start looking for other places. I'm driving all over, reading everything I can find. And the more important thing is I got 3 to 4 hours with people. I can't go all the way to the Waterton Canyon. And so where can you look? The Big Thompson Canyon became better and better and better with populations. It turns out it's a really beautiful place. But even down in the canyon, we've had massive impacts. The 2013 flood, sheep moved drastically. So one of those amazing facts to understand is bighorn sheep only go where they're taught to go. And so they have to learn places, and it takes them many, many generations to learn. But it takes weeks for them to forget a spot. If they're stressed, if they're impacted, they may never go back to this area. And that's exactly what I've seen. Places that were almost every day turn into never. And so there's these moments that are fantastic and beautiful, and then you hope. This is right where anybody remember where the dam was, right past the fire station? This is that area right below Palisade Mountain. And one magical foggy day, these rams are just right on the roadside, walking right at us. And if you know about our local history, recently we had a fire, and it made it all the way to Palisade Mountain, the Alexander Mountain Fire. And so I was desperately looking for sheep the last few weeks, and they're there. They're not all gone. They're not as robust as they were last year and the year before, but they're still in those areas. And so hopefully they'll recover. But those are changing too. Now, one of these animals that we definitely see a lot less of in the last 20 years is Avery squirrels. I used to be able to find these guys almost any time I went out in the right habitat. And now, it's almost never when I want to find one. And it's always with a client that couldn't care less that we saw this rare, amazing squirrel that you see bouncing through the forest. But it also leads to that question, why? What's changed with them? Almost definitely it's because they eat the bark of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir trees. And those ponderosa pines are the ones that were killed by the pine beetles. They're specifically looking for a tannin level smell in the trees, and if you ever smell those wonderful ponderosa pines, the more intense the smell is those tannins. The squirrels are looking for ones that have more digestible tannins. And those are the ones that the beetles like to kill, it seems. And so the population of squirrels has gone way down. Also, if you look around town, you do see eastern fox squirrels, and they're competing a little bit around town, but that's not the name of the national park. And talking to folks, it's not just here in the time I've been here since the early 2000s, but since about the 80s, their population has plummeted, and the pine beetle probably has a bit to do with it. And they're amazing. If you ever see a black rabbit, it's definitely an neighbor squirrel. They're kind of awesome. They're about 23 inches nose to tail. They're massive, and it's something that's slowly disappearing. But there's other animals that have changed in different ways. When we talk about invasive species, this is one of them. Wyoming ground squirrels are not native to this area. They were first seen in 1911. And so I always like to have the debate, and we'll talk about it later, are moose native or not? But these guys aren't native either, and the Park Service is not wiping them out. But they have made a huge impact. Their population boomed in the span of a century. When I started doing tours and you drive into upper Beaver Meadows, you'd have to swerve everywhere to not hit a Wyoming ground squirrel, no matter how hard you try. Every year, you'd have a few that just, they were suicide machines. They'd always just get out there and get underneath your tires. But these guys, golden mountain ground squirrels, they're our true native ground squirrel. It's always hard to imagine that they were outcompeted by these lowly other ground squirrels. And so this is the part that's so amazing. Wyoming ground squirrels are the longest hibernator in the national park, about 8.5 months. And so where that becomes utterly fascinating is they got a teeny tiny brain. And they are the easiest thing to catch because you can't be smart if you're focusing on sleeping most of your life. The average Wyoming ground squirrel only lives to be 3. And so if you start thinking about how many months of your life are you conscious, they're asleep much longer of their life than they are awake. And if you think about it, one of those amazing things as we're moving into the later season, just doing your taxes is about 400 calories. And so using your brain is important, and you can't have a highly motivated brain if you're sleeping most of your life. But if you get really deep into hibernation, they're not sleeping, they're actually unconscious. One of those really cool ideas that recent research shows is it's more like being anesthetized, not being asleep. So they're not dreaming too. But if you're gonna hibernate, you better get really fat. And so what's always amazing about these guys is they get really big because they have a very long hibernation. And just like with marmots, the fatter you get, the slower you run. And so with these animals being everywhere in the lower valleys, Moraine Park, Horseshoe Park, they were everywhere. And then the 2013 flood happened. And if you understand that this is one of the longest hibernating animals in the whole park, when the flood happened a month after they went into hibernation. And so somewhere between 80 to 90% of their population disappeared in a day. And so we're still slowly rebounding. These squirrels take years to repopulate because they only reproduce once a year. It takes forever for them to get going. And so every creature that relied on these animals, the Wyoming ground squirrel, are also impacted. And so one of those things that I never thought would happen is watching badgers disappear. One of these moments I'll never forget. We're out on tour, we're driving, and I have a husband and wife duo, and the husband is so passionate about animals, and the wife is very passionate about shopping. And so she's along for the ride, and we're looking at elk in Moraine Park, and the wife out of the back of the car says, "What's that dirt flying out of the ground?" And there's a badger throwing out dirt. We're having this most amazing moment, and that doesn't happen anymore. And so back in the early 2000 teens, it was quite possible. 5%'s not great, but keep your eyes open. You'd see a badger a few times a year. And after the flood, that stopped. And so out in Horseshoe Park, this is a really good example, they throw dirt. What's amazing about badgers is they're going to dig a new hole every night in the summer months. And then what's really amazing is they go from hole to hole to hole that they dug and see who's in there and eats them. The other thing that's amazing is that animal can dig twice as fast as a man with a shovel. So they can outdig these ground squirrels. So here's your great vocabulary word of the day. They're fossorial mammals. They live underground most of the time. And so you'd have these moments where they pop out. But after the flood, those moments have disappeared. Now that doesn't mean they're gone, doesn't mean you can't find a badger, but you gotta look for places where the flood didn't kill all the squirrels. And so, in the edges of town, down in the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, but up here in the national park, that's something that's completely disappeared in recent years. And then the only badgers I've seen in roughly the last decade is up on Trail Ridge Road. Now, if you know anything about the summer, there's a lot of cute fuzzy animals being very active up in the tundra. So that makes a lot of sense, but what used to be this extremely populous animal has to collapse. And so that amazing moment of seeing a badger, has anybody seen a badger locally in the last 5 years or so? Oh, actually, Andy doesn't count, he goes around too much. But it's harder, it's still possible. They're not gone, but they're much more rare. And on that same idea, I used to almost guarantee my clients that we're gonna see a coyote if we looked. When I first got here, in that 2005, 2010 era, there were coyotes everywhere in the valleys. But there was also elk everywhere in the valleys. And so my sighting chances have dropped by 2/3. And so what used to be a near guarantee of, hey, we're gonna almost definitely see a coyote, turns into, oh my God, we saw a coyote right there. It was this fantastic sighting. And I always love is, if you like anything about dogs, you'll love coyotes. And so the puppies, oh my goodness, there was these moments where we could see puppies out there in Marine Park and Horseshoe Park. This one year, they denned it right next to the visitor center in Beaver Meadows. You'd park the car in the parking lot, you'd walk over, there's a crowd of people, and what's amazing is they denned right next to the weather station. It was awesome. It was the shortest walk, they were really reliable, and then the 2012 fire happened, and they moved. And so now, you can still see coyotes in many places. I'm not saying they're gone, it's just the consistency. I'm looking for 50% or better most of the time to make it worth the time, and now it's a 20% chance. So up on Trail Ridge, every once in a while, there's a coyote just walking the road. One of those amazing ideas is one of the safest places to be as a mesopredator. Apex predators, mountain lions, wolves, grizzly bears, they don't want to be anywhere close to people. But coyotes love being right next to people because people are distractions. And so as the cars are driving by, that's a great distraction to go hunt some ground squirrels, hunt a marmot. But in the past, it was really possible to see a coyote on a carcass a few times a year. And so one of those things that's amazing is that opportunity is also declining because the elk are not here in the wintertime the way they used to be. And so pay attention to the dates here for a little bit. So October, there was a lot of elk in Marine Park. This is right at Bear Lake Road. And remember those days, you'd go into the national park and there would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of elk everywhere you looked. This is the most I ever photographed. This is all handheld really quick, just documented on a tour. When I went through Photoshop and counted them, it's 462 cow elk. And that's early November. Did anybody see any elk in Marine Park in early November this year? Definitely in September. And there's a few, but hundreds?
I think I saw heard of about 100.
Oh, okay. Lucky you. They were there for about 2 days, maybe. But all those elk in Marine Park made an impact. And so they used to not migrate, they'd stay in that valley. And so what's amazing is golden banner is a pea. 85% of peas on Earth are poisonous. elk can't eat golden banners when they're in bloom, but they can in September, October. And so golden banners are everywhere the elk are, and all the other flowers that the elk can eat, those are gone. There's nothing. If you go to Moraine Park in that summer season in early June, what you see is almost exclusively poisonous plants like golden banner and Rocky Mountain iris. And so back to that idea of there used to be all these elk. Now I can't guarantee every day that we're going to see 100 elk right out the park. But if you show up in September, oh, that's easy. Show up in October, go to the golf course, really easy. I have to drive away from the bulls sometimes, charging the car if you're in the wrong place in traffic. But to find them in August, you got to get way into the high country. But to find them in December, January, February, what used to be an easy drive to the edge of town is now a 30-some mile drive down to Loveland because they're migrating more. And that's the part of these numbers. They're changing. And that's the part that I always have to think back, is I was here at the very end of the highest population ever. The first time I ever came to Estes Park was 2002. There's reports from the late 90s that the population was between 2,500 to 3,000. There was a point in Moraine Park where there was 283 elk per square mile. That is a record for elk in a natural environment. There's supposed to be 28 elk per square mile in a healthy population. And about 50 to 60% of the elk in the 90s lived in town in the wintertime. But that still meant there were a few hundred, maybe 1,000 elk in the national park. By 2010, those numbers have dropped. We started the elk management program around 2008-9, and those populations were coming down. And there were still, a few hundred elk potentially in the national park. And the national park would always talk about that about 65% of the elk lived in town. And so if you got that wonderful opportunity to see the presentation in early January about elk, the last count was 33 in the national park in 2023. But I was just down in Loveland and there were 400 elk at Nampa Park. And the elk with our collars, I saw the same elk that goes in my yard and goes all the way up to the Alpine Visitor Center. And it was all the way down there. And what's utterly amazing is they're migrating. And I don't know if y'all noticed, but this year, they seem to migrate even faster. Remember we got on Highway 36 the last few years, and there would be a bunch of elk right there by Jellystone Park? That didn't really happen much this year. Seems like they migrated faster. Maybe the temperature, but man, they made it in Loveland. And I detest social media, but I joined the Lovelanders Facebook group entirely so I can track elk and I don't have to drive all the way down there. And man, on November 11th, people started talking about seeing a whole bunch of elk. And so through the season, there's opportunities where we can see wonderful animal opportunities. They're pretty reliable, but that opportunity is going down. The numbers are down. If it was 3,000 elk years ago, man, they were everywhere. But there are places to go if you look in the right places. Sheep Lakes in the springtime, not a bad place to see some bull elk. And I always love this April to May phase. They look so bad, they're so easy to see. They're right next to the car, and they are the ugliest, miserable looking animals. But it is amazing to think about that every year, their antlers fall off on March 8th through the 16th. Unless it's leap year, and it's shifted. But every year their velvet comes off on August 8th through the 16th. So that growth, looking here in early May, is 1/2 cubic inch for the largest guys per day of volume. Second fastest growing animal tissue on Earth, second only to moose antler, faster than fetal tissue and cancer, which is pretty amazing. And so every season they start down in the low valleys and they work their way up. And so this is right by the Alpine Visitor Center. Everybody talks about how busy it is. You just gotta show up at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's never busy at 5 o'clock in the morning. And there's these amazing opportunities at first light or last light. And then you have these amazing moments where there's likely going to be activity. So here at the Continental Divide, there's going to be bull out there at sunrise and sunset, but they'll almost never let the sun touch them. So you gotta show up really early, really late. And so what that means for me is not a lot of sleep in August. It's a really early sunrise, a lot of early sunsets. But if you get out there at the right times, you see these amazing moments. At the same time, what used to be my everyday spot is now most of the day spot. Because if you look in the background of that shot, there's a lot of dead spruce trees. As those spruce trees died, starting around 2012, 2013, the elk started going into the forest a whole lot more. As those trees died, the acidity level of the soil started going back to more balance because the trees drop their needles and that acidifies the soil. That change of pH changes the plant opportunity. And a lot of those plants that the elk are looking for are in wet soils. And if anybody's ever been up Mount Ida, knows that that hillside is incredibly wet and full of snow. And so that's the rule of thumb. If you want to find elk in the summertime, go wherever the snow has been 3 or 6 weeks ago. If your feet are not wet, you're not going to find bull elk. And so if you time it just right, like I told you, and know exactly what date this has to be, it's between August 8th and August 16th. I had this one client, really avid wildlife photographer, and he's like, I want to photograph bull elk losing their velvet. And I said, okay, we have 3 days, it's most likely, and this is the first day we went out. And so you have these moments. This is the picture I took with him. It's amazing. These bulls started sparring in the flowers. It's spectacular. But no one ever plans their vacation. No one plans their tour for losing that except that one fella. And every year, he moved to Estes Park a few years later, and every year I see him and his wife in that exact same spot because that's the magic place to be at the right time. And then every year, the elk are going to come down, and here's Atlas with his girls later on in the season. And it's not like it used to be. There used to be 4 or 5 herds of elk in Moraine Park. Now it's 2, 3. But one of those things to think about is up the valley and to the left. That's where the shade is. Climate change is making a huge impact on these animals. And remember, you used to be able to go into Moraine Park and the meadows would close at 3 and then 4:30. Now it's 5 o'clock. That change is because it's getting hotter. They're not out there in the sun. But what bums me out the most about this change is I can't take this picture with my clients anymore because there's hardly any elk when those cottonwoods change. One of those amazing ideas, if you're not familiar, is those cottonwoods were planted by Abner Sprague because, or for the Sprague Resort, I should say, because that's where the pool used to be. And so there's these non-native trees, they belong down in Loveland and Fort Collins area, but they're amazing for this opportunity, right on the edge, right before the Moraine Park campground. And this year, I didn't see any elk in that spot when the leaves were great. They were all at the golf course. And that's the thing. I used to scoff at people, like, oh, you know where I saw elk? Oh, I was like, the golf course, right? I'm like, oh yeah, how'd you know? And I'd look for nature, and it's getting harder and harder because they're realizing that's the greenest grass. The more hot temperatures we have, the more they go to the watered lawns of the hotels and the golf course. And then like magic, every year, the golf course stops watering the golf course. And they leave in the 1st to 2nd week of November. And they've really figured it out this year in particular. It's one of the hottest years I can remember as far as consistent 15 to 20 degrees above average. And they all go down a little. But this change leads to impact. Without hundreds of elk in Moraine Park, things are getting better. We put up a bunch of fences. Those fences are working. Imagine the government does things for our benefit. And so we added all those fences. The elk stopped showing up all winter long. And so these places that were devoid of bushes exploded with bushes. And so pay attention to that rock. It's the same rock in every picture. And so 2009, everything's degraded. It's all pretty sad. 2017, I finally could go back to that place to take a picture because forever there was a fence in the background. And the willow bushes grew so much that it's this lovely scene and it's robust. And that's where the beavers come in. If you start roaming around in those areas, there's beavers in a lot of our fenced off areas on the eastern side of the national park. But this is where perspective comes in. It's not a great time to see beavers, but Rocky was an amazing place to see beavers, so much to the point that Enos Mill wrote a groundbreaking book about beavers. So time travel with me to the map and the past. Why is the beaver ponds called beaver ponds? Because we all missed it. If you weren't here in the 80s, you wouldn't have seen all the beaver ponds at the beaver ponds. And people hand me the map, and they're like, where's these beavers? And I'm like, not there, because times have changed. But those beavers weren't always in that spot, because you take a look, in the modern day, all of those beaver activity went away because the elk moved into that area. And then what I always love is the irony is the national park built that lovely boardwalk, and a few years later, the beavers were gone. And so the elk took advantage of that. And now, it's a great place to see a moose very seasonally. And then September, if you're up there on Rainbow Curve looking down, you get a lot of optics. The moose really love to be right about there. Gotta look really careful. If you're down there by the road, it's really hard to see. But back to the map, the beaver ponds. The names are not always accurate because you went to the wrong time. Wrong time, a decade, wrong century sometimes. But if you go back in time, down below, there's this open meadow with this lovely little stream running through. But if you were here in the past, that was full of beaver ponds. So much so that that's where we used to go ice skating. They would do ice skating activity there in the wintertime, and that was the beaver ponds. And so here's where we can do a little deduction. Trail Ridge Road is not paved in that picture. It wasn't paved between 1932 and 1935. So this picture is from sometime in that time frame. Same idea. Look at that amazing view we don't get because you're a century too, or more than a century too late. But these guys are amazing, and that's why Enos Mills wrote a book about them. They're just fascinating. But if you think about it, why do you write a book about that? Because there were no elk. There were no moose when Enos Mills was here. And so what's the next most amazing animal? Definitely beavers. They're basically little humans, I'd argue. They have these lovely families. And if you remember, you could go down to Fish Creek, and there was this amazing population. It was really hard to park legally, not make all the people in the neighborhood upset. But it was this amazing, like clockwork. Every day at 6:45, Papa Beaver comes out and check the environment. At the very end, before the 2013 flood, there were 7 dams across that area and many beavers. I counted 8 at the highest. And then the flood happened, and all these amazing moments sort of faded away. And so 2014, what was my every day, let's go looking, turned into this desperation. And so this beaver was at Lily Lake. Enos Mills talks about this in droughts, that the beaver would sometimes go up to Lily Lake to evacuate. And so Lily Lake leads us to this important side quest. How do you tell a muskrat from a beaver? And so dark nose, big ears, big football, beaver, muskrat, that light nose, almost non-existent ears. And if you go up to Lily Lake now, it's not really likely you're going to see a beaver, but about every 8 to 10 years, beavers show up. And what used to be this amazing lodge about a decade ago is now a small pile of sticks by our lovely boardwalk. But here's where the fun part of the conversation gets better. We're moving through the positive stuff. The beavers came back. The moose have been exploding. When you just look at the early days, the park talks about in the 2000s, there was about 60 moose. Now there's over 200. But every one of these moments are places I don't see moose anymore. Because that whole part of the Kawanichi Valley was a great place to see moose. And so if you look at those places, it was fantastic. The first moose, 1860, Milton Estes. I would argue that they may have been native. If we hadn't shot them all, they may have shown up in this area. But when the state introduced them in 1980, they showed up to the park. And they exploded to the point that the western side of the park was a great place, one of the great places in the United States. And then around 2010, I started getting these stories. There'd always be this lady with a little point-and-shoot camera. She'd say, I saw a whole herd of moose. And I'm like, a herd of moose? And she's like, yeah. And I look at her picture, and there's always elk. But then I get a person saying, I saw one moose. And it was black. And he's like, oh yeah, definitely black. And these moose started showing up more and more on the east side. Cub Lake, the pool, these areas that started around 2010. And the bushes over on the west side of the park were slowly degrading. Around 2014, you could really see it. And for years, I was talking about in that decade that I don't know what's going to happen, but someday those moose sightings will disappear. I used to just drive to the beaver ponds on the northern side of the valley. There would be 5 or 10 moose out there. We'd turn around and go look it up at the Continental Divide. Sometimes the elk would be there. But that area was devoid of moose around 2014 for reliability. Doesn't mean you can't find 1 or 3, but I used to find 10 or 15, and then you started seeing them at Sprague Lake, and Cub Lake and Wild Basin. Sheep Lakes, it wasn't until about 2015. And then the fire. Everybody says the moose came over because of the fire. That's not the result, but a lot of them sure came over after the fire. But they were already on this way because they were destroying a lot of those ecosystems. So the biggest moose I saw the whole last 2 years was right there. You need a lot of optics to see that big old bull, but man, is that awesome. So when the fire came through, it devastated what was already left, that little bit of habitat. Those bushes were so limited. And so here's the map of the fires, and that southern side from the East Troublesome Fire, that was a great place to go see moose. And so, where did they go? Well, just like everything, I have to sit down, buckle down, try to figure out these things. And the sad story is what used to be an out-the-window encounter turned into a 1-mile encounter in the spotting scope. But the single best place to see a moose in this national park in the summer is not Sprague Lake, and it's not Sheep Lakes. It's right below Medicine Bow Curve in the Poudre River Valley. 8 to 15 a day. You gotta be there really early or really late, but they're all over, and they're refugees, because if you walk into that valley, I always love it, I take people up, they're like, well, I wanna see it closer. And we try, but I always talked about, nobody wants to do this 6-mile hike, and I had a client do it with me this season, and it was the wettest, most miserable hike I've ever done. We saw moose, but I had mud up to my knee, going through and trying to be as delicate as we can. But these are the places the moose are now. They've moved east. Makes it great. I drive a lot less. I get 15 more minutes of sleep a night because I don't have to drive all the way to Grand Lake and all the way back. And so that's one of those beautiful things. Moose are coming onto this side, but the impacts are greater. And so the beaver ponds has moose. On the west side of the park, right by the Betty Dick area, once in a while, you can see a baby moose until about June 15th. But they start to move up, and that's that part where if you look around Tree Line and the Alpine Visitor Center or over by the headwaters of Big Thompson, they're all over the place. And the biggest guys, and I can never get close to them because it's only a 5 or 10 mile hike, and most of my clients say, how far do we have to go? But I always tell people, if you need to see a moose, you can just sit at Sprague Lake in the summer, in the spring, part of the fall, but my records show you have a 20% chance per hour to see a moose at Sprague Lake, and Sheep Lakes is even a little bit less. But Sheep Lakes is turning into Moose Lakes. When are we going to change the name there? Because the sheep aren't showing up as much. And then rounding out, this is not a story of doom and gloom. The moose are coming back. The beavers are having a heyday as they're slowly coming back. And turkeys. Oh my goodness, there are turkeys everywhere. They're all over. My first turkey I saw, it took me 1.5 years to see a turkey here. And now I can show you 5 or 15 a day in the mediocre places. But that's one of those artifacts. Climate change brought down so many of those trees from the pine beetle. That made it perfect habitats for turkeys. And so with less coyotes, less badgers, way more food, turkeys are doing great. And then, fun side note, what are baby turkeys called? Say it louder. Poults. Poults, because like poultry. And so one of my favorite facts is just like coyotes, no matter how many babies they have, how many poults, 2 will survive in the span of a year. So you better have a lot, because at the end of the year, there's going to be about 2 of them left. Because everything loves to eat those poults. But adult turkeys are not dumb, they're quite amazingly smart. They're just do goofy things. And so the worst trade always throughout the season is the moose disappear right around the 15th of September unless you get really good into bushwhacking. And then we trade it for turkeys, and nobody's excited about that. But I think it's amazing. They dance, they sing, they're dinosaurs. And then ospreys. Oh my goodness, there's ospreys at Lake Estes. I used to drive all the way to Grand Lake to show people ospreys, and now they're flying over my house on a daily basis. I stop the tour at the end of the visitor center maybe, and right there. And then the animal no one books a tour to come see is the best. It's a heyday for deer, because those elk aren't out here competing and eating the same bushes in the wintertime. I have a number of books from the 70s that say Rocky Mountain National Park is one of the great places to see giant mule deer in the West. And that was definitely not the case when I first got here. But this book is right by the visitor center sometimes. That colorful background is Elk Meadows RV's playground. It's amazing how the deer are out. So the story is not everything is better, but some things are, and we gotta take advantage of those moments, because there are some things that are amazing. You know, if you can get something stuck in your antlers, you look better for the girls. And so, it's not all doom and gloom, but be so thankful and precious of where we live, and thankful of what we get, but it will change. And so I got hopefully 40, 50 more years to see what this changes into, but it's been an amazing adventure so far. So I appreciate y'all. And have a great rest of your afternoon. Open up the floor to questions. You guys are curious about anything? And so, sure, Celeste.
Jared, I called the golf course
Right.
a year or so ago and asked them about fertilizer, pesticide, all that.
Right.
And they do treat the golf course. So my question is that having a huge impact on wildlife?
That's a great question. And so I can put my own personal experience there. I went to Penn State. I have a degree in recreation and park management. The other kids in my same degree worked in the PGA department. And I had to work in the summer season somewhere. And so I worked at a golf course one summer, my first summer in school. And there's this horrible chemical you put on a green. And at the time, 20-some years ago, it was $400 a gallon. And it stops grass from growing on the green. So I had the same thought. I started reading about this. And what's fascinating is they don't live long enough to get cancer. And so yes, it's probably not great for them, the same way it's not great for us. But just like us, if you eat pesticide plants, if you eat any food in today's world, you're getting some pesticides in you. But you know, the theory always is everybody at age 20 has about 20 or 30 cancer cells. It's which one's going to get you, and maybe none. And so for these guys, luckily they don't live long enough. But if they only lived at the golf course, that would compound. And so it's not a huge issue, but it's an issue. I wouldn't eat an elk that ate nothing but golf course grass. So luckily our elk aren't coming from there. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I live at the I live at the Good Samaritan Village on the east side of town.
Sure.
And yesterday morning, the herd of elk was down in the swale below our home, and one of them was a cow with a white face.
Yeah, this is piebald. So
she's not well known.
Yeah. So this is why I detest Facebook, but I use it to track animals and see what's going on. She's the only famous girl we have. And so everybody wants to see the piebald elk. So the statistics tell us there's about 1 in 100,000 elk get piebaldness. And so it's a genetic variation. If it was complete, it would be a lunistic animal. And they can be melanistic if they were all dark. And so she's got a little bit of genetic variation on her face. Excuse me, that's just an animal that's just slightly off in her genetics, and not going to kill her likely. She's doing fine. But yeah, she's the only famous one. That white face is really unique. And that's one of those things I find amazing. I saw her all the way up by the Alpine Visitor Center in August. And she made it all the way down to town in about 3 weeks. She came down the corridor of Highway 34, and she's one of that roughly 150, 200 animals that seem to be staying in town for the winter. So hopefully you'll see her again. I'll be driving by her house a lot looking for activity, because that is a great place to look. And that's the thing I love now is you used to be able to just stay in one meadow, And now you gotta check every address in Estes, because those females go all over the place. They're definitely not consistent. But when you find them, oh my goodness, you find them. So that's a fantastic sighting.
Yeah.
Anybody else? That's nice and quiet. Well, I appreciate your time. I so much appreciate your interest. And the biggest thing I'd say is get out there, keep looking, and we appreciate what you got, but also know that it may not last forever. So thank you so very much, and I appreciate your interest.
Thank you.